Hello and welcome to this special post-election program, Aftermath and Aftershocks. While analysts and pundits will be dissecting the results of Tuesday's elections for some time, there are a few things we know for certain, and those are the aspects we will focus on here today. In the next hour, we will look at what happened, look at the evidence that may suggest why it happened, and we'll discuss the way forward. In just a moment, I'll be joined by Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan, outgoing chairman of the House Republican Study Committee. Also joining me today will be FRC Action Senior Vice President Tom McClusky with a look at how pro-family forces fared in congressional races and state initiatives. Derek McCoy, who headed up the Maryland effort for marriage, one of 4 states that had marriage on the ballot, will discuss what took place there. Matt Lewis of the Daily Caller will give his perspective on where the Republicans went wrong in Tuesday's election. Kellyanne Conway of the polling company will take a look at the message voters were sending to Washington and whether or not that message has been received. FRC's resident historian, Bob Morrison, will put this election into a historical perspective. And we'll also be joined by one of the new conservative leaders elected Tuesday, Mark Meadows of North Carolina. And then Dr. Jim Garlow will join me to answer the question that I believe is on the minds of many Christians in the wake of Tuesday's election. Where do Christians go from here? Well, joining me now by Skype is our first guest and a good friend and a conservative leader who was reelected on Tuesday, Congressman Jim Jordan, who represents the 4th Congressional District of Ohio. Jim, welcome to this special post-election webcast.
Good to be with you, Tony.
Well, Jim, let's just start with this. Obviously, Ohio, a key swing state on Tuesday, and the turnout was much different than what was anticipated.
Yeah, it was still pretty strong turnout for, we thought it would be a little bit depressed on the Democrat side compared to 08, and at least initial reports and numbers I'm seeing, it was actually relatively close to the record high turnout that they got in 08. Our turnout was good as well, but not quite good enough to overcome that and to bring Ohio into the Republican column, both for the White House race or for the president race and for our U.S. Senate race, which was big here in our state. So disappointment, but I think the key thing is, while we're disappointed, let's remember that life is full of setbacks. You learn from them. You take into account what you could have done better or different. And you stay engaged. I mean, this is important. I think the number one message that we need to think about today is Christians need to stay active because our country is still the greatest nation in the world, and it's at a critical moment. And we need to stay engaged in this process and fight the good fight. So that's the takeaway I got. I'm disappointed like everyone else, but look. Let's just redouble our efforts and let's keep on fighting for those principles that make us great in the first place.
Well, Jim, I want to ask you about that, but first I want to step back for a moment. And I was in Ohio over the weekend. Yeah. A lot of activity in Ohio. I spoke in 2 churches there on Sunday. And my sense was there was a lot more engagement and commitment in this election cycle than what we saw in 08. What was the deciding factor? Why do you think that the Republicans did not do as well?
Well, I think a couple things. One, and I sensed the same thing you did, Tony. I mean, it felt so different than 08. You could feel it. I've been all over our district, all over the state, frankly, all over the country. You could feel the energy and the enthusiasm there. And I thought we were going to win. I thought we were going to win the White House in Ohio, and I thought we were going to have a new U.S. Senator in our candidate, Josh Mandel. So I felt the same thing you did as I was out and about.
Oh, we're having a little technical difficulty there with our connection. We'll see if we can get Jim back on. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask Tom McClusky to join me. Tom is Senior Vice President of FRC Action. And I want to cover some of these races. And let me know if we get Jim back on, because I've got a couple of other questions I want to follow up with him on. But we saw some victories in Congress. A number of conservatives who were in hotly contested races won. So not all was lost yesterday.
Right, and in some, it was, for conservatives, there were some pickups. In Texas, Ted Cruz, who we came out for the FRC Action PAC and FRC Action very early, Ted Cruz cruised to victory. I'm sure that's probably a headline.
Not a gain for Republicans, but a gain for conservatives.
Right. It was Kay Balley. He's replacing Kay Balley Hutchinson. In Nebraska, you had Ben Nelson, who's seen as a blue dog Democrat, conservative Democrat, saw the writing on the wall because of his support of Obamacare. He retired. Deb Fischer is another one that we supported. Very strong conservative, and she also saw victory last night.
I think we have Jim by phone. I'm going to go back to the phone where we've got Congressman Jim Jordan. Jim, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, Tony. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there.
No problem. That's the trick of modern technology. It works when you don't need it. But look, let's go back. You know, we both saw that enthusiasm, and everything on the surface looked like it was trending toward as you said, a Romney win of the White House, Josh Mandel. All the polling up to Election Day showed those things neck and neck on both races. Right. Was something missing on the Republican ticket that would put it over the top in terms of the social conservative involvement?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I do think the hurricane and hindsight made a difference. The momentum was going our way, and I do think that impacted. But I also think you got to look at the candidate. Mitt Romney's a good man and a good family, but let's just be honest. Republicans nominated the most liberal Republican nominee in history. Here was a guy who actually passed a health care proposal in Massachusetts, similar to what President Obama passed, which the voters obviously don't like. Here's a guy who has waffled on the life position over his career, and so and here's a guy who some people had doubts whether he was as really strong and committed to opposing tax increases and limiting spending. So I think. In hindsight, you look at that, and it's like, here was a guy who was the most liberal nominee in history for our party, and that has an impact on motivating people to come out and vote. And so I think that hurt us in the long run.
Yeah, I think we did have the potential to have, with Barack Obama on the ballot, an election of contrast. Where you have a candidate who stakes out a clear position on life, which Mitt Romney had stated but didn't campaign on it. Same thing on marriage, same thing on religious liberty. Three areas of clear contrast between the candidates. But it does seem that message was not lost on the Democrats, because Barack Obama clearly campaigned on those issues while the Republicans did not.
And Tony, it was even worse when we had a couple candidates for Senate who made some ridiculous statements, but when our party was so quick to run away from these guys and in essence run away from the issue, that hurt as well. I think it was Reagan who said, well, you want to paint in big, bold colors the distinction between you and the other guy, and when you try to run in this gray area to some degree, that ends up hurting you when it comes to your turnout and your enthusiasm.
Well, we know, Jim, that you have certainly stuck to those bright, bold colors when in your leadership position in the House, and it certainly has done well for you and other conservatives who have stood up on those principles, and we appreciate that. And we know that there is a pathway forward. We're going to talk about that more today in this program as we look at the issues and the challenges before us. But want to commend you on your leadership, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the House of Representatives to hold up that conservative banner and stand upon those principles that Reagan and other successful leaders have stood upon before us.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tony, and I appreciate the great work you've done. My favorite scripture verse, as you know, is 2 Timothy 4:7, where Paul talks about fighting the good fight, finishing the course, and keeping the faith. And I think that's our charge. We do that. And as you and Tom were talking about, we had some bright spots yesterday where some good conservative, pro-life, pro-family candidates won.
All right. Congressman Jim Jordan, thanks so much for joining us.
You bet. Take care.
Well, Tom, as we said, there are some bright spots, but there's a lot of not so good news that came out of Tuesday. There's no way to put a spin on that. We saw the Democratic Senate expand its number of seats. We can dissect that, and Congressman Jordan alluded to that, about the establishment running from candidates who maybe inarticulately but staked out conservative positions.
Well, and there, if you contrast it with, take Elizabeth Warren, who beat Scott Brown up in Massachusetts. For us, it's a wash. Scott Brown was a liberal Republican. Yet Elizabeth Warren faked credentials, said she was a Native American when she wasn't. What did the Democratic Party do? They embraced her more. They just didn't talk about that issue.
You know, I would look going forward. Now, then I want to get into some of the state issues that we saw, because, again, some not so encouraging news on that front, but I think there's a bigger story behind it. What I see unfolding here, though, is the potential of what happened in 2010 to occur in 2014. You saw in 06 and 08 the Democrats were able to expand their margins, take control of the United States House by knocking off liberal Republicans and electing moderate Democrats. Many of those moderate Democrats were forced to vote on Obamacare and other radical policies from this administration, and they were replaced in 2010 by true conservatives. So we still have the most conservative House of Representatives in modern time. Most of those conservatives, with few exceptions, were, I think with maybe one exception, were reelected yesterday. And what we may be setting up in 2012 or 2014 is we see the Democrats having to defend about 20 seats in the United States Senate, and I think the Republicans about 11. Many of those states the Democrats will be defending are from states that Mitt Romney, even Mitt Romney, as moderate as he was, carried in Tuesday's election. So you could see, Arkansas, Louisiana, South Dakota, Alaska, states that could very well be prime territory for conservative candidates to win in the Senate races.
And also, Obamacare, unfortunately, just wasn't that much of an issue this time around. I don't know if people have just forgotten from 2010, but a lot of the bad stuff in Obamacare starts taking effect January 1st. You're going to see your taxes go up. You're going to see your policies change.
Was that another one of those issues where they just didn't talk about it? Where we heard,
it was.
Where it's kind of like as the Republicans bought into the media's line that this campaign was all about the economy and jobs, and that message just didn't seem to carry the day.
No, and I mean, partly, and I think Mitt Romney ran the race he could run, except he was hampered because he helped pass an earlier version of such universal health care on the state level, and that certainly hampered him talking about it.
All right, what are some of the other highlights, or lowlights, if you will, of Tuesday's election?
Well, on the state level, as you were talking about, it looks like Massachusetts tried to pass an assisted suicide, allowing for that in the state. It looks like it lost in that very heavily Catholic state, at least there. And you even had Victoria Kennedy, Ted Kennedy's widow, speaking out against it. On the issue of life in Montana, parental notification won overwhelmingly, over 70% of the vote.
And that's interesting because the Senate candidate in that state did not, the Republican candidate did not win.
Right. And I'm sure if you looked at it, I mean, there had to have been a lot of crossover votes there. And that's something we should hold that senator to, the new incoming senator. The issue of marijuana was very big this year. We had 6 states that voted on different issues of marijuana. And Washington State and Colorado legalized all marijuana.
You're not blowing smoke, are you? Really?
It's lunchtime and I'm very hungry, but that's about as far as I'm going to go on that topic.
You know, that is kind of amazing. Although we've seen this trend, I would have to say that this is one of those examples. What we saw in Tuesday's election is the effect of elections. Elections have consequences. And I think the last 4 years of the liberal policies of this president, Barack Obama, and now another 4 years that we're looking at, that they have a shaping influence on the culture.
I think we're going to see that, and especially we've seen the rhetoric just in the last 4 years go so far down, where we even had an incident here where the culprit is the person who did it, but the rhetoric that surrounds it certainly contributed to it. But I mean, last night, what we saw also on the issue of marriage, it's something, and I know you're going to be talking to Derek McCoy shortly after this, said we lost in all 4 of those states, and that's something we need to look at. That
was Maryland, Maine, Minnesota, and Washington State. Now they were close in most of the states. What was the breakout on the spending in those? That tells part of the story.
The spending this time around, it was almost normally we're used to 2 to 1, 3 to 1. This time around, it was about, if you add them all together, it was about 7 to 1. It was very big contrast. And the other side, you now have companies and corporations coming out, and Amazon, the owner of Amazon, gave about $1 million, I think it was, to the Washington State. Costco, one of the owners there, gave money as well. That you're seeing corporations now either being bullied or they're not exactly reading their customers.
You know, that is an issue of significance, because there's a double standard there. When you had one business owner just simply make a public statement in support of marriage, it was as if the sky was falling when Chick-fil-A, when Dan Cathy made the comment about marriage, how they became the target of so much venom. But yet then on the other side, you've had businesses that have given millions, literally millions of dollars into the effort to redefine marriage, and it has been applauded by the media.
Right, and some have even gone farther, like Target, which gives monies to organizations that seek to ultimately would run Christian adoption agencies out of business.
Well, Tom, let's hold that right there. Just stay with me. And I'm going to go to the phone line where we have Matt Lewis. Matt is with the Daily Caller. And I think Matt has, I was reading some of the stuff that Matt had put out there, in part kind of where did the Republicans go wrong. Matt, welcome to this special post-election webcast, Aftermath and Aftershocks.
Indeed. Well, thank you for having me.
Now, I know you're anticipating a new arrival there in the Lewis family, so we appreciate you stepping away from the delivery room there for just a moment to join us. Give us your thoughts on where did the Republicans go wrong in this election?
Well, I was prepared to blame Mitt Romney for this, that he was, this is what happens when you nominate a moderate. They have to, sort of be something they're not to win the primary. And I was prepared to talk about a lot of different things, but ultimately I really do believe that the Republican Party now faces a pretty serious crisis. And I think, Ronald Reagan, as much as I love him and as much as I think he really overshadowed politics for decades, it's kind of time for the Republican Party to reinvent itself. Now, I know a lot of my colleagues think that means that Republicans should become more moderate. That's not what I mean. But I think it is time to find a way to make conservatism relevant to a new generation and, frankly, to larger demographic groups. So I think that Republicans have their work cut out for them.
Yeah, the exit polling, the early exit polling shows that the Republicans did not make any gains within the minority communities. I think when you look at the Hispanic community, we're going to be talking about this with Bob Morrison in a little bit about how parties that appear to be anti-immigrant suffer in the polls. But one of the areas that is a bridge into the minority community, the Asian community, the Hispanic community, is the value issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think if you actually look at the issue set, conservative values, family values are pretty darn popular with immigrant groups. Especially Hispanics, which tend to be Catholic. So I think that's a winner. I think that the loser, though, is this perception, which I think is false, but it's there nonetheless, this perception that conservatives and Republicans are racist or don't welcome them. And I think that people, they don't vote on issues. They vote on emotion. We all do that. And so if you have the sense that people don't like you, it really doesn't matter if they have a better tax policy. And so I think, unfortunately, Republicans have projected this image, and that's a real problem. They need to do something to fix that. I mean, look, it's not just the social issues where I think conservatives agree, but, immigration is the most entrepreneurial thing you can do. If somebody chooses to move their family to this country to seek a better life, those are great values. Those are people who are entrepreneurial. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and the Republican Party needs to do a better job of letting them know that they're the party for them.
Let's go back to a minute to the standard bearer in this election, Mitt Romney, who, as we've already talked about, personally I like him. It was kind of slow in coming to gain the confidence of conservatives, and obviously in a hard-fought primary, a lot of a lot of issues were raised that further questioned his conservative credentials. But did the Republicans fail to draw that necessary contrast in this election from your viewpoint?
I honestly don't think so. I think I might be in the minority. A lot of my conservative friends believe that the problem was Mitt Romney didn't hit Barack Obama hard enough and that Mitt Romney wasn't tough enough. I actually disagree. I was not a huge supporter of Mitt Romney's, and I was very skeptical of some of his flip-flops. But I think at the end of the day, he ran a pretty good campaign. And I think after that first debate in Denver, conservatives did coalesce around him. And I think that I was prepared. If you're a writer, you think, well, what's the story going to be tomorrow? What's the narrative? What am I going to say was the big lesson learned? And I was prepared to write a story about how the lesson is you shouldn't nominate a moderate who can't, make conservatives happy, who have to kind of keep pandering to them the whole time, and it seems awkward and inauthentic. I was also prepared to write about how it's a mistake to nominate a rich guy who can't appeal to populists. Ronald Reagan could appeal to Reagan Democrats in Ohio, working class folks. Mitt Romney, sort of as a CEO, couldn't do that. But it turns out that wasn't what decided the election. I think there are much bigger environmental factors playing against the Republican Party right now that really Mitt Romney, I think, probably did about as well as he could have done.
Well, Matt Lewis, thanks so much. Again, we appreciate you stepping away from an important moment in the life of your family, but thanks for joining us. And
my pleasure.
We wish you and your family well. Well, Tom, we mentioned just a moment ago the 4 states that had marriage on the ballot, and I think we have Derek McCoy. Derek McCoy is going to join us. There he is right there. Derek, welcome to the special post-election webcast. Well, there he was. See if he comes back.
Oh, I'm here. Can you hear me?
All right, we've got audio, but no video. Hold on just a second, Derek. We're going to work on that. And let's go back to some of these other...
Well, there were some victories on the pro-family front. The issue of sexual orientation, 2 cities in Kansas, and I should probably ask you to pronounce these because you had to do, you did radio for
Salina,
Kansas, and Hutchinson, Kansas, where we were involved in the Kansas Family Policy Council. Certainly led the way, getting names on the ballot and to get it on the ballot. In both those cities, families won.
And that was interesting because those 2 cities in Kansas were targeted by the national homosexual groups to go in and pass these special benefits protections for homosexuals, which were turned back.
Right. It's something the Democrats, even when they had the majority, weren't able to do on the federal level, and they're trying to do it. And I mentioned Obamacare earlier, and Obamacare was somewhat split last night in the fact that Florida actually voted, one could even say in favor of Obamacare by striking down an amendment that was on their ballot. And 3 other states, though, Missouri, Montana, and Wyoming, though, did vote to kind of symbolic slap of Obamacare, saying that you don't have to force people to buy health care insurance. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, of course, the Supreme Court says, yes, you can, and that overrules any state amendment.
All right. Well, we have Derek McCoy, who headed up the Maryland marriage effort. Derek is joining us. We have him by phone. Derek, welcome to the special post-election webcast, Aftermath and Aftershocks.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Well, Derek, I know you did a great job there in Maryland, working within the African American community and beyond within the churches. But in the end, the effort came up just a bit short, and so Maryland's marriage amendment, or the effort there to protect natural marriage, fell just a few votes short.
Yep, it did. We look at it. Our first and foremost thought is that we did a heck of a job. I mean, it's been quite a long battle on our end of it. When we looked at how it was in the legislative session, we won it there once, came back again, very narrowly passed the legislative environment, got the petitions on when they said you couldn't get those done, and then we're at a very narrow margin on this issue. Matter of fact, the way we see it as well, and we are sending out a bit of a statement, but one of the things that we see that was really concerning to us, in one of the counties that had, we won, when they sent out absentee ballots, they forgot putting the question on those absentee ballots. So there are a lot of interesting things that happened through this process, but at the end of the day, right now, we do understand that we have to concede this issue to the other side at the moment, but it does not mean that we go away, or it does not mean that people do not believe in natural marriage between a man and a woman.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Derek. And I will say this: I mean, this is the first time where we've had people in a state vote for the redefinition of marriage. Up to this point, it has been courts. It has been a couple of legislatures, primarily the courts. But then in Tuesday's election, we had the voters in 4 states that, contrary to what's happened in 32 other states, we now have 4 states that have voted for a redefinition of marriage, or at least not voted to put a constitutional amendment or amendment into their constitution defining marriage. Derek, you touched on this, but let me ask you this. I don't foresee this issue going away.
No, it doesn't go away. I mean, and our biggest job is to make sure we show up at the fight and we make sure we stand strong on what we believe in. I think it was clearly over 1 million voters voted that marriage should be defined between a man and a woman in the state of Maryland. Yes, this is the first time by majority vote that it actually passes. But I think the other thing that we need to look at is, and I've said this consistently since we've been out in Prop 8 with California, it's great that we won. The challenge is that we also saw the strongest demographic that was there, which was the African American vote, and other groups followed. I think what we see here in Maryland specifically is that while the African American vote was strong, it was not as strong as it has historically been, and that was quite directed towards how they advertised, how they spun the story in the state of Maryland. Tied it very closely with, I think, the presidential election, tied it closely with Obama's recent evolution, the NAACP, and several other things. And, me being African-American, I know specifically how that has affected the community. And those are the things that we're going to have to look at, the way we strategize this going forward. What do we do? And ways to, even communicate our message even more effectively and better in all communities. Because marriage is one of those things that cuts across, political lines, denominational lines, socioeconomic lines. It really has no space in that regard. And it's one of those things that we really can continue to push forward in our society unashamedly. Because we know that, natural law is true and how God set it up is the way it needs to be.
Derek, one final question before I let you go. You touched on this, but the fact that the president, who had kind of up until May of this year kind of been in the shadows on this issue, coming out saying clearly that he supported the redefinition of marriage, did that have a measurable impact on the African American community there in Maryland?
It's good to say. It's hard to say if it was him or if it was the NAACP or the African American pastors that they kept touting on ads. And you got to look, Tony. One thing that's clear is that everything that they did was pitched toward the African American community. There were no ads with Caucasians. There were no ads with anybody else. It was a straight African American pitch, from the radio ads that were run with Obama saying his evolution to NAACP members and others talking about their issue. And the way we've approached it consistently in the state is, marriage, like I said, cuts across all these different lines. But I think it does have some effect at the end of the day. We do notice that there was some level of effect, and this was going to be the first state that really saw the effects of that. In North Carolina, he had just barely said it, and that continued to go through. But in Maryland, I think they had time to gear up with an advertising campaign in addition to his statement that did penetrate and sway people. But the interesting thing, though, I'll say this, in that community, when we talk to people in the street, they still really don't believe in, changing the definition of marriage. It was more about this whole concept of fairness or equality or civil rights that was the questionable issue for them. But they did not necessarily believe that marriage should be redefined.
Derek McCoy, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was Derek McCoy of the Maryland Marriage Alliance. Tom, I know we've got the values bus that's here at FRC after traveling through, I think, about 28 states, racking up over 70,000 miles, registering nearly 500,000 new values voters, and you're going to be down there with Connie Mackey here in just a moment. But before you go and Bob Morrison joins us, I want to draw attention to something that Derek said. On this issue, even though for the first time, voters may have voted to recognize the redefinition of marriage or same-sex marriage, you can make something legal, but you can't make it right. And what I mean by that, we are now approaching the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. 40 years after the Supreme Court said that it is lawful to end the life of an unborn child, it's still seen by over half of Americans as morally wrong. And I see this issue of marriage the same way. The people can vote on it. For the first time we've seen that. Courts can rule on it. But I don't think you can violate natural law and force Americans to recognize it as morally right.
I think the term for a lot of things over the next 4 years is going to be civil disobedience is going to come up quite a bit. And both you and I came to FRC around the same time, and it was about 2003. We were immediately hit with the Goodrich decision up in Massachusetts. And what I've seen from there, because one thing I noticed in the 4 states that I personally noticed, the ads that the other side is running right now, they don't run ads anymore of like homosexual couples or anything like that. They run ads of, as Derek was saying, of black pastors and of other people. Because I think part of that is they know that there is still that factor out there that people are uncomfortable with the redefinition and when it's put right in their face.
Yeah. And I think just as we have seen with the issue of life, where the trend has been toward a pro-life perspective, to where now a majority of Americans are pro-life, and in part it's because of they've seen the issue. Technology has obviously helped us see into the womb, and we see that in fact the child is a child. But I think as we see the fallout of this redefinition of marriage, as we see more of the cases like the Sarah Crank in Maryland, the little girl, that 14-year-old that got death threats for simply speaking out for marriage, the fact that curriculum in our schools are being changed, church institutions losing their tax exemption. So as we begin to see this as not simply what happens at the marriage altar, but literally the altering of society, the freedom of religion, and the freedom of speech, I think the perspective of many Americans will begin trending back in the other direction. Well, I know you're going to go down and catch up with Connie at the Values Bus, and Bob Morrison is going to be joining us here as we look at the sometimes when you're in the midst of this, you get tunnel vision. You look at it and you think this is set, this is the perspective. But let's put this into historical perspective. What does this election mean? Where do we go from here? And can we bounce back? Obviously, 4 years of what I would call socialist-leaning policies of this administration was not enough to convince Americans to move the other direction. Have we been here before? And what can we expect maybe 4 years from now? Joining me now is Bob Morrison, Senior Fellow here at the Family Research Council, author of a number of books, worked with Bill Bennett on a number of his projects, and one that I turn to quite often for a historical perspective. So give us, Bob Morrison, a historical perspective here.
Well, Tony, as you know, there's an ebb and flow in politics. There's an ebb and flow in the national life. There are times when certain parties and certain movements are just said that they're down and out and they're never coming back. That was said about the Republicans in 1974 in the Nixon era when Nixon left office in disgrace. And Ronald Reagan was the one who came in and said, you've got to reassert what your core beliefs are, and you've got to say it and assert it in ways that welcome all those who share these values to come and join in our effort. And that's what he did. He broke through the barriers. He didn't look at red state or blue state or anything like that. He invited people who had never supported him or his party before to come and reconsider. So that's one example of rejuvenation, bringing it back. You can see it on the other side. During the Reagan era, George Will used to say that the Republicans had an electoral lock on the Electoral College, and that couldn't be broken. Well, Bill Clinton figured out a way to break it in 1992, and he came back for his side. So there is that ebb and flow, and it can happen. And so I think the thing to do is not to abandon your core beliefs, not to abandon the people who have so loyally supported you, but rather to make new friends, to make sure that you bring people in who have not heard your message before, that you have a way of expressing your beliefs to them. When Reagan left office, one of the most moving things he said in his farewell address, he described an American aircraft carrier, the USS Midway, and a group of boat people from Vietnam. And they came, and this boat was overcrowded. There were families on there, little children. They were almost about to founder and sink. And they hailed the American sailor and said, "Hey, American sailor, freedom man." And Reagan welcomed that. That was symbolism for Reagan. He was welcoming these refugees from tyranny abroad. And that was symbolic of his whole approach. So I think that's the kind of view we need to have, is a welcoming approach.
And that goes back to a conversation we had earlier about the need to broaden on conservative principles. Yes. The parties there, and that would be, we talk about the Hispanic community, the Asian community, the African American community even, when we have these shared values based upon these founding principles which are founded on transcendent truth. Now's not the time to abandon those principles.
Absolutely. One of the things you've just had Derek on. I have to congratulate Derek. I was a volunteer. I was one of his foot soldiers in Maryland. I saw the best organized effort in Maryland by Derek McCoy that I've seen for any cause, any candidate in 25 years of living in the state. So he brought together all kinds of folks who were there to support marriage. And ultimately it didn't succeed. It was outspent 7-1. And tragically, I think, one of the major parties utterly abandoned the state. So that makes it very hard when you have one party engaged and trying to overturn marriage, and you have the other party sort of ignoring it and not making even a recommendation. It's hard. All the effort, and it came so close, all the effort, I think, is to be credited to the work that Derek and his folks did.
You had mentioned earlier, we were talking about Lyndon B. Johnson and the Great Society and how the pendulum swung to the left, but as a result of that swing, yes, we saw the pathway forward to a Ronald Reagan.
Yes. It seemed that the Republican Party ceased to exist. Lyndon B. Johnson carried 44 states in 1964. He had a Congress that completely did his bidding, but that lasted only for 2 years. And then the internal inconsistencies of what he was about, his terrible policies toward the war in Vietnam, his terrible policies toward the domestic issues. He had core strengths, his strength on civil rights, his strength on voting rights. But other than that, the story was that Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty, but poverty won. And it's from that time that we date some of the terrible breakdown of families in our inner cities. That from his policies and the way that he approached it. And we are living with the consequences of that breakdown to this day.
Well, Bob, thank you for that historical perspective. I think sometimes when you look at it from that perspective as well as an eternal perspective, it helps us make a little more sense of our present circumstance and helps us see beyond.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Bob. Well, one of the issues that I think led many to think this was trending a different way was the polling data that was coming out early in this election. And going from here, part of it's going to be messaging. How do we communicate these principles, these time-honored principles? And joining me now to talk about that, Kellyanne Conway, who with the polling company. Kellyanne, welcome.
Thank you, Tony. Lovely to be here.
Surprised by the outcome yesterday?
Not entirely, and particularly not at the Senate level, which was a real disappointment. I think at the U.S. Senate level, we see first and foremost, Tony, that candidates matter and campaigns matter. And you had a number of Republican candidates who I think did themselves very few favors out on the trail, buying right into the media entrapment on the so-called war on women nonsense and trying to get out there and defend marriage when all you really have to do is say what voters in 40 states have said, which is marriage is between one man and one woman only. Leave it at that. And I think that at the House level, you saw some of the redistricting really caused some of these Republican dominoes to fall, but you see great people, great friends of the movement, and clients of mine, frankly, like Steve King and Michelle Bachmann, who stared the left in the face and the war on women in the face, and really formidable opponents, and never wavered, never decided, oh, you know what, those votes I've taken I won't take now because I'm in a slightly different district. And so there is a model there. There's a model there on how to win.
Yeah, well, I think it's that contrast, I think,
yes.
And that was what I saw in part was we had the stage was set for clear contrast, and in some cases, and I think even in the presidential, those contrasts weren't brought completely before the voters.
Well, they weren't. In fact, we do a big post-election poll every year, as you know, and one thing I will tell you is that voters were a little bit confused as to what extent Obama and Romney held positions on certain issues that I know that you care about. And frankly, health care and Obamacare and the paying for abortion in Obamacare is still on the ballot. It doesn't matter that it was passed in March of 2009. It doesn't matter that the, quote, conservative, end quote, Supreme Court upheld it this past summer. Voters are still not satisfied with the possible implementation of Obamacare, and part of it is because it does not, it violates this precept of not paying for abortions by taxpayers. But you need contrast. As we like to say, you can't beat vanilla with French vanilla or even honey vanilla. You have to give the voters rocky road. But Obama had tremendous, an incumbent has tremendous advantages, and I think the difference now, Tony, from when I started out with Dick Wirth and Ronald Reagan's pollster is, years ago you can draw a straight line between presidential approval, right direction, wrong track, which is both an economic and a moral indicator, and the state of the economy. There's no direct line anymore because too many Americans are afraid to change the captain while the boat is listing, and in fact while it's sinking. They get nervous. Well, who's the other captain? And this captain seems like he's trying hard. And what about Bill Clinton saying no captain could have turned it around in 4 years? Maybe there's point to that. So our nervousness, our fear of change, and almost principle is paralyzing many voters into this complacency that they themselves tell pollsters they're not really sure is the best route.
Then was this election about the economy and jobs? Is that what it was about?
Well, it was at the top level. The number one issue, of course, was economy and jobs. But that ironically, economy and jobs only got Mitt Romney to about 41%, and it only ever got Barack Obama down to about 41%, which tells you, well, then how do I get the other 9 or 10% that I need? The answer is very clear. It's on the social issues. It's on the moral issues. It's showing that contrast and saying, who really are the extremists on abortion here? Which party actually believes that, in addition to being indebted to China, we ought to have their laws, their views towards little girls, and not have a ban on sex selection abortions here? Which party stands for upending the Carhart decision and re-allowing really no protections for minors that want to get abortions, and in that case, allowing partial birth abortion? Which party refuses to let the District of Columbia, where you and I stand as we speak, to have some kind of reasonable abortion law, because it has none? And that party is very clear. That's the party of Barack Obama and many of these radical feminists like Elizabeth Warren and Tammy Baldwin who were elected last night.
So is it the narrative that accompanies those principles that the Republicans have just not gotten a handle on?
Somewhat. I'll tell you, presidential elections are different in this regard. There is no candidate recruitment necessary, meaning once you've got your nominee for president, that's what you live with. So then you're trying to find the voters, inspire and engage, or maybe enrage the voters. 2014, like 2010 or 1994, is different. The voters will be there for us. 2 more years of this guy in office, you want to see lines to vote. The voters will be there for us, Tony. What we need to do early on, as soon as we get off this platform, is go and recruit candidates and tell them you will be supported. That we conservatives of conscience, are going to start using you can win, he can win, she can win, with respect to conservatives and not moderates. That's where those 3 poisonous words always upend the conservative candidates, is hearing that the, quote, moderate can win at any level. Let's get a head of steam behind some of these great candidates who are probably thinking, I need to get off the sidelines and go and run, but will I be supported? Do I have a shot?
Mm-hmm. Do you foresee in the days ahead that within the establishment or within the Republican Party, that more moderate camp, that there's going to be finger pointing back and forth in an effort to try to explain these losses as a result of conservatives?
They probably won't do that. They probably put Hurricane Sandy and demographics and locusts ahead of conservatives this time, but we'll be right after the locust. And that's going to be unfortunate. I don't know how they can possibly say that unless they see data that shows that there were so many conscientious objectors, so many values voters that stayed home, that they cost Romney the election in important places. But that's a hollow argument when you have Paul Ryan as your VP running mate, and that's a hollow argument when you have some of these candidates up and down the ballot who did well, like Michelle and Steve, like Mike Pence, the new governor of Indiana.
Right.
And there are other examples as well. If they try to blame conservative, what they usually try to do, Tony, is the establishment, the consultancy class that I call staff infection, of course, they try to blame the candidate ultimately. If he had only listened to me, if he had only taken my advice, he was difficult. He said the 47% remark. He didn't do well in the second and third debate. It's always the candidate's fault. But no, I think the biggest loss, the biggest missed opportunity in 2012 elections for Republican was not learning enough from 2010. And I believe Axelrod and company in Obama land in Chicago studied 2010, and we forgot very quickly the sheer strength in numbers of being against government expansion, stimulus, out-of-control spending, taxpayer-funded abortion. We lost that 2010 zeitgeist thinking that presidential election years are somehow different.
Will the pendulum swing back?
Yes, I think 2014 will be a huge year, not just for Republicans, but more importantly for conservatives. But I also predict that Obama is not going to be this, quote, radical that everybody fears. I think this man is probably going to be, at least for the moment, satisfied with his legacy of the first African-American president, the first president to support gay marriage, and then, of course, a successfully reelected president. He's all about biography, so he's got a pretty good one right now for him.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I'm
Let's
going to
make it
hold you
happen.
to that. Well, Kellyanne, thanks so much
My
for
pleasure,
joining
Tony.
us. Well, folks, over the last 14 months, the values bus has been crisscrossing the country, taking the messages to churches and conservative groups, tea parties. We have racked up, I think I mentioned, over 70,000 miles and registered almost 500,000 new values voters. Many of them, hopefully all of them, participate in this election, but the work is just beginning. Let's go to Tom McClusky, who's down at the Values bus, parked on the street in front of FRC, along with Connie Mackey, who is the chairman of Faith, Family, and Freedom Fund. Tom?
Hi, this is FRC roving reporter Tom McClusky on the beautiful FRC Heritage Foundation Values bus, and I'm sitting here with a mastermind who helped keep both FRC employees like myself and Bob Morrison away from our families for almost a full year, and she kept away from her own as well, though from what I hear that's the request of some of her family. But Connie Mackey was the one who came up with this, what turned out to, I think, a great idea. And, well, Connie, what was the evolution of the bus?
Well, Tom, as you know, the PAC and the Faith, Family, Freedom Fund have just so much in their budgets, unlike Karl Rove or the R-N.C. or the Republican committees. And so we had to think of how we could best use the supporters' money and get the biggest bang for the buck. So we decided that, and actually it was based on experience, because as you remember, we had gone out to Iowa on the judge bus, where we had 3 judges who had overruled the will of the people on marriage there. We went out there and did a whistle stop tour through the state, and by the time we had finished that tour, those 3 judges were gone. So we felt success, and we thought, well, why not do it for the year that was so important before these presidential and senatorial elections around the country. So we did get out there, and we did raise the money, and we're so grateful to our supporters that made it happen. We had a great team. We had a great bus driver, Scott, and we had Kathy Flavin doing the daily planning, and we had Chris Bosch riding full time on the bus to hand out all the things that the materials that we handed out, and we really connected with thousands of people.
Well, I know every time I went out on the bus, I always came back encouraged because of the enthusiasm that we saw. There were a couple of times that somebody would follow the bus. When we'd stop to eat, they would pay for our lunch. And I think I personally, I was in about 10 or 11 states. How many states total did we visit? And what do you think the general overall reaction was from both churches and Tea Party groups that we met with?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that the lunch part was most obvious to you, but that's okay. We'll move on from that one. Actually, we were in 26 states, plus D.C. was the 27th. We were in 146 cities. We connected with new churches that we felt like we brought to the FRC's pastor outreach program, and we were all over the country with them. We helped to register almost 500,000 people, beginning with our I Vote Values program. So we really feel that this was a very worthwhile venture, and it's obviously something that we will look to in future projects at Family Research Council, getting the biggest bang for the buck. It's a rolling billboard across the country. The message is sent in that way. Getting the free media as we went, like you said, connecting with people directly. I think we handed out over 10,000 bags of policy information. I think that has to be the biggest direct handover of policy information that we've ever done from the Family Research Council. And of course, our partnership with Heritage helped garner us a lot of new people who had come to see Heritage's bus and found and got introduced to the Family Research Council for the first time. So all in all, from the perspective of the Family Research Council, it was a win-win. We of course wish that the elections themselves had turned out better.
I would request any future bus tours not to be a year long. And I'm sure others would request that as well. And even though this was a C3 project, we did have a C4 component, and we got to hang out and meet with. You met with Mark Meadows, I know, and we did an event with him thanks to the bus. And I met with Andy Barr down in Kentucky, a new congressman from Kentucky. Overall, I think I think this was a great idea, and I think it's not only brought FRC out to the people, except also brought us to the people as well. And thank you for it.
Thank you, Tom. And we're very happy about Mark Meadows, and did get to do events with him several times. And Mark was, I know, excited to see us, and we're always excited to see Mark, and we're especially excited about his victory.
Thank you. Back to you, Tony.
All right, that's our roving reporter, Tom McClusky. He's found a new job. How about that? Well, the bus, as mentioned, had traveled across the country, registering almost 500,000 new voters, and many of those voters voted in legislative races. They voted for the first time in congressional races, and while on the national scene, the elections did not go as we had hoped. We did win a large number of the congressional races that we were involved in, some of them pickup races, open seats. And one of those races in which we saw a new conservative face elected is from the 11th Congressional District of North Carolina, Mark Meadows, who is the Congressman-Elect from that district, and he is joining us now by Skype. Mark, welcome to this special post-election webcast.
Tony, it's good to be with you, and as always, I appreciate what you stand for, and truly it's what we stand for, and it's a bittersweet day. We obviously finished well, and it was because of FRC Action PAC's involvement in our race very early that made a huge difference in our race. And so we know that we've got our work cut out for us, but I believe that the conservative message, the pro-family message, the pro-marriage message, pro-life message is one that still resonates well with voters. We've just got to be bold in taking it out there and not be ashamed of what we stand for.
Well, Mark, let me ask you this. As you, obviously, as you mentioned, it's a great victory there in the 11th Congressional District of North Carolina. The other races, at least the presidential race, trending in the opposite direction. As you come to Washington, you'll still be in the majority in the House of Representatives, a conservative majority. the Senate still in the hands and control of Harry Reid. What's going to be your perspective as you come here to Washington? Will you stick to that same message of faith, family, and freedom?
Well, not only will we stick to it, we've got to stick with it, not because it's necessarily good for votes, although I believe that it is, but we've got to stand up. We ran for 15 months, Tony, in an election that started out with 11 candidates on the Republican side of it, so we were a victor there. But even as we were running in the general election, the message by most of the consultants and everything is moderate what you stand for. Don't take more of a centerline point of view, and we didn't do that. We stood up for what we believed in, and quite frankly, every time that we did, the results were overwhelming. People are wanting their candidates on the conservative side of things to be different. And yet what we do is we all of a sudden change our mode of operation very quickly and believe that we need to moderate what we say or change what we say. And we can't do that when we run for re-election, and certainly I can't do that as I go to Washington, D.C. Y'all got involved in our race very early on, and we really had no help from the establishment. And as we see it, that's good, because we had a very solid victory last night, and it looks like as long as we continue to represent the people of Western North Carolina, we'll be able to serve as long as we like.
Well, Mark, you had not held office prior to this running for this congressional seat. I want to ask you a question that I think I'm going to talk with Dr. Jim Garlow here in a moment to address kind of the spiritual implications here for Christians as they think through this and where we go. But from the activists, you've been a longtime supporter of those who have made themselves candidates and of organizations that have worked to shape public policy. What would you say to those like-minded social conservative Christians out there who are saying, you know what, this didn't turn out the way I had hoped? What do I do now? What's the way forward for them?
Well, I think the way forward is to not give up. We can look at Scripture from that standpoint, and when David slew the Philistine, the odds looked overwhelmingly in behalf of the enemy. Gideon's army was just a small group of people that were well prepared, ready to go. And so we can see time and time again throughout Scripture that sometimes the enemy looks formidable and like we can't win. And obviously we know that our God will not be mocked, and our God reigns. And so he is the same God that still reigns today as he did many, many, many years ago, and even before Christ. And so, let's go back to the biblical truths that we have. Now, that being said, we also need to understand that even as Christians, we get that influence from the world to say, perhaps you don't say that, you don't want to be offensive, and I want to be. I've got a real compassionate heart. I love to give, and really I love to make sure that people feel welcome. But with that, we can't moderate what we say. So my challenge to those that are listening is you need to continue to give. Don't give up. And actually, as we see many of the people that perhaps could be running for office, you don't have to have the previous experience. I was a business guy that believed that we needed to take a business approach, a conservative Christian approach to Washington, D.C., and hopefully we'll be able to see many more. And there are like-minded folks. We've gotten calls from a number of members already that believe that we need to stay true to our message.
Well, Mark, we look forward to seeing you here in Washington, D.C., and thank you for running an outstanding campaign and standing strong for the values that all of us here care about.
Well, Tony, thank you so much, and really I want to echo one other thing that was said by the pollster earlier. We need to get our war chest ready, and we need to be prepared to serve and support those conservative candidates in the primary. FRC, we supported a lot of different ministries, and FRC was really the only one that got on board with us early. And normally when other groups come in, they come in way too late to really make a difference in terms of the candidate. The establishment will get behind whoever the nominee is, and so we need to make sure that we do that in the primary process.
I think you're absolutely right, and we'll be doing that. Mark Meadows, he is Congressman-Elect in the 11th Congressional District of the state of North Carolina. Tom McClusky joining me back again. I want to, Tom, touch on something that Mark just closed out on. You know, all eyes focused on the presidential race. And again, I mean, I'm not going to try to spin it. It was a disappointment, a huge disappointment. When we got into the general election, Mitt Romney was the nominee, and the positions that he had taken were in clear contrast to Barack Obama. We didn't control the campaign, but we saw his positions on life, on marriage, on religious freedom. And so we were, you know, I personally, FRC Action was supportive, or FRC Action PAC supportive of that. But in the end, he didn't prevail. However, when we look at the congressional races, when you look at the true blue candidates, and this is very important, folks. I want you to hear this. We're about to wrap up. Jim Garlow is going to be joining us in just a moment as we close out. But when we talk about what candidates stand for, those firm conservative principles, which are founded on that transcendent truth of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, that we're endowed by our Creator with those rights. When you have candidates that stake out positions on that, we call them here our true blue candidates. We recognize them based on their votes in Congress as whether or not they're a true blue candidate. And of the true blue candidates, we saw a pretty high re-election rate for the true blue candidates.
And that's not really unusual. And there are still a number of races that are still out there, eight or nine that are outstanding that we haven't heard back yet, including a close friend of ours, Alan West, who's also a true bluer. However, out of 169 endorsements that we did, 129 confirmed wins. It's about a 77% rate.
Now that's overall. The 169.
That also included there was lieutenant governor, judges.
Yeah,
that
those are some actually non-federal. But I think we had, of our true blue, we were looking at about a 90+% re-election rate for the true bluers that we endorsed.
And that's normally what it is. It's usually in the high 90s because these people elect people who stand by their values, I believe.
And then overall, we're looking, and of course there's still some outstanding. If you take those that we don't know the outcome yet, we're looking at actually above 80% for all of those candidates that, with your help, we were able to endorse. And we saw a Supreme Court justice in the state of North Carolina that was elected, re-elected, who is standing on faith, family, and freedom. Other state elected officials as well. So, you know, we've got a great farm team. And when you look at future candidates for president, I don't think the Republicans have had a stronger, conservatives I should say, have not had a stronger bench than what we're looking at today.
Right, and I mean, just look at who everybody wanted to pick for VP. And we have to be wary because there are still a number of the more liberals out there, like Chris Christie and those, except you have Marco Rubio, you have Bobby Jindal down in Louisiana. You have Rand Paul, who is much more solid conservative than his father, Ron Paul, who's a perpetual presidential candidate. He would be fantastic. Mike Pence, who's newly elected, a bright spot last night.
Well, actually, that's another aspect. You had two pickups for Republican governors yesterday. I think now the Republicans have the most seats or most governorships in recent history of any party. You still have legislatures and states trending to the right, so conservatism is still alive and well at the state level.
Right, and that's why we need to expand more into those.
Well, Tom, I know you've got to get out back on the street to do some more reporting. Some men on the street maybe today.
Asking people, do they know who won? Perhaps.
All right, Tom McClusky, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, folks. as Christians, we have to analyze these situations through the lenses of Scripture. And not only do we, as we talked with Bob Morrison earlier, want to have a historical perspective, that yes, our nation has embraced leaders that have taken us down a wrong path, liberal policies, policies that undermine the founding freedoms. No question about it, the president we've had in the last 4 years and looking at for another 4 years has taken us farther than we've ever been before. But that doesn't mean as a nation we can't come back. Doesn't mean there's not lessons that we need to learn from this, both politically and spiritually. What might God be saying to us? You know, it's an amazing thing that God has given man a choice. And we live in a nation that allows men to make choices, and they have made choices. Now, that means we may have to live with the consequences as a result. But how do we face that as Christians in America in the year 2012? Joining me now to talk about that as we close out this special post-election webcast is my good friend Dr. Jim Garlow from Skyline Wesleyan Church in San Diego, California. Jim, welcome to this special post-election webcast.
Thank you, Tony. Good to be with you. I tend to see it from three perspectives: that of a pastor, that of a bit of an amateur historian, and then as a husband. From a standpoint of a pastor, the analysis we've heard is largely political rhetoric, and it should be. The political nuances are the way we should articulate this, and your guests have done a phenomenal job. No. I tend to put it in the rather distinct or biblical terms, and that is basically the problem in America is sin. And tearing of a baby in the womb is sin. Destroying the definition of marriage that God has established is sin. Spending our grandkids' money, illegally taking it from them, that is called sin. So from a pastor's perspective, I see sin. And how do we have sin? We have silent pulpits. And so we've got to get pulpits to be talking openly about the Word of God. As an amateur historian, my PhD's in historical theology, the issue for me is one of we have no problem that the next Great Awakening cannot solve. And this day or tomorrow may be the day of the next Great Awakening. And so it's with anticipation, I want to see the outbreak of God's Spirit in such a way that the result will be that sin will be exposed and there will be repentance in the nation. But the third way that I tend to view it is that of a husband. That applies to me in a way it won't necessarily to every person listening. But I've said openly for the last couple of years in talks that I've given that I tend to see it through the lens of a pastor who's fighting for the life of his wife. By that I mean she's battling with stage 4 cancer, as many people know. It was April of 2010, seated in this very chair where I now am, where I got a phone call from an oncologist informing me the cancer had come back for the third time. It actually has now come back 7 times, and we've not been able to get back in remission the last time. But at that time, it had come back for the third time. My wife was not here. I called by myself, and I asked the oncologist a question perhaps I should not have asked. I said, barring a miracle, we fully expect a miracle, but barring a miracle, how long does my wife have? He answered the question. Now, his answer is irrelevant. The point is, about a week or so later, sitting in this very same chair in my study in my home, I felt the Spirit of God say to me, if I heard God properly, you're fighting for the life of your wife and you're fighting for the life of your nation, and barring a miracle, both of them have a short window of time. And that was April of 2010. Let's jump it ahead now, and here we are in election time, where the nation has chosen 4 states to violate what God has said, do not put asunder my definition of marriage, where a nation has chosen the president who 4 times voted, 4 times, mind you, voted that if the baby survives a botched abortion, the baby should be left to die. That's who people in America chose. We can't blame Barack Obama for all. We can blame people who have sin in the human heart who can't grasp the evilness of those kind of actions. So we find ourselves in a situation. Here's the lens through which I see it. I'm not suggesting everybody else has to see it through this lens. This one guy's perspective. I see it through the lens of the battle of cancer. Even if Mitt Romney would have won, the nation still has advanced stage 4 cancer. There's sin in the human heart, and further catastrophic nationwide is pandemic. But we find ourselves in a situation where the person who did win is opposed to biblical principles in a wide range of topics. So I see it through the lens of fighting for the life of my wife. On Friday, we got the word that her cancer markers are increasing rapidly. and she's way too weak for treatment. She's dropped down to about 100 pounds, and she cannot take any treatment. And then on Monday, we got word that the liver is beginning to malfunction. The enzymes are off potentially. We had yesterday going to an emergency MRI being taken to try to see where we are and what we do. And we'll be hearing just momentarily of what our options are. Now, that is not good news. It is bad news. America is like my wife. America has stage 4 cancer, quite advanced, and is in a weakened condition. But what does that mean? Does that mean we give up? Absolutely not. My wife is in a bed about 50 feet where I am. And when this phone call is done, the first thing I'm going to do is go check on her, see how she is, get some food for her. I'll be talking to the doctor today, see what her options are. We explored a lot of alternative treatments as well. And we will continue in a very proactive, aggressive battle. Is it harder now than it was a couple days ago? Yes, for our nation and for my wife. Do we have a tough few years ahead? Yes. I would say this is a tender thing for me to say. Everyone knows the fact, the reality, and the promise of the kingdom hereafter. If somehow we do not succeed in seeing my wife come back to physical health here, we know she has eternal life. And I cling to that on this day. I've been married to her for 41 and a half years, and we are madly in love, and the thought of being without her breaks my heart. But I do know the reality of the truth of God's Word. Now let me make the jump to America. Nations come and nations go. The kingdom of God will last forever. America will not always be. When I arrived at Tampa at the GOP convention, the taxi driver said, "Are you here for the Republican convention?" I said, "Well, yes, I am, but I'm here as a follower of Christ." I wasn't reporting for duty as a Republican. I was reporting for duty as a follower of Jesus Christ. Nations come and nations go. They don't always exist. America will not always exist. I love her. I grieve deeply for her condition. America has stage 4 cancer. It's very advanced. But I will not give up on her. But I will remember this. If somehow, in the passage of time, America has lost, the kingdom of God will continue on, and God's truth continues to march. During the days ahead, the pastors that stood up and godly Christian people who stood up, be encouraged, because your ranks are about to be increased. Why? Because the heat is about to be turned up tighter, it's about to be turned up higher on American Christians. Those who are truly followers of God are about to experience a higher cost for serving Christ. It's called persecution. It will come in varying form. But the fact is, there's going to be increasing numbers of, up to this moment, silent pastors or silent followers of Jesus who are now going to recognize how wrong they have been in their silence. And they'll be emboldened by the Spirit of God, by the Spirit of truth. And our ranks are going to increase, and they're going to increase dramatically. Is it going to be a good 4 years? Well, I think it could be a very painful 4 years in many, many respects. But the people of God are not reliant upon who is president and who occupies the White House. It's who is king over all. And Jesus is still king. Yes, America has stage 4 cancer. So does my wife. So I'm going to continue to fight for the life of both of them. So it's a joy being with you. Thank you for what you do all across the nation from there at FRC.
Well, Dr. Garlow, thank you for taking time out to join us for this webcast, and know that we are praying for you and for Carol, and we, as you, are standing on the promises of God. Well, folks, I want to thank you for joining us in this special post-election webcast, Aftermath and Aftershocks. And you know, as you've heard here, there's no spin on what took place yesterday. The information was, the outcome of the election was in some cases surprising, other cases disappointing. But that in no way shakes our confidence nor our calling. We as Christians, as Dr. Garlow talked about, we're called to be salt and to be light. We are citizens of two kingdoms. We're the citizens of the heavenly kingdom as we follow Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. And fortunately, we're citizens of this nation that we call the United States of America. And there have been times in our past where we have chosen the wrong path. the consequences, unfortunately, as a nation, we've had to endure. I recall one, John Quincy Adams, who fought hard to end slavery and became such a thorn in the side of the politicians. He had been president, turned around and ran for Congress to be a voice for those who did not have a voice and to stand for what he believed in, the principles of this nation. And they were so aggravated with him that they passed a provision not allowing slavery to be mentioned on the floor of the House. And he was approached at one point and said, Mr. Adams, don't you ever get discouraged because you seem to stand alone and the forces and the culture and the trends are going against you. And this is what he said. He said, duty is ours, results belong to the Lord. So ours is to respond in obedience, to be salt and to be light, to speak the truth, to speak it in love, but to speak the truth nonetheless. And my commitment to you here at the Family Research Council is that our team will continue to stand, to defend, and to advance. Yes, you heard me correct. Advance faith, family, and freedom here in America. And I hope that you will continue to stand with us as we are a witness and as we are salt and light here in our nation's capital. From all of us here at the Family Research Council, thank you for the contributions that you have made in making America stronger, and we will continue to stand and hopefully, prayerfully see America return again. God bless you.